Hi, my name is Parmjeet Sembi, and I'm going to be doing my reproductive presentation for the portfolio submission. Okay, so we're just going to be talking about the feedback loops in the non-gravid female reproductive system. So just to start, we're going to go over a little bit of the female reproductive system here. So you have the ovaries, which you see in the diagram. The ovaries are responsible for producing gametes or eggs every 28 days in the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is a 3 to 7 day period of bloody uterine discharge. This is known as menses in itself. So we have the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Ovarian cycle changes are the changes in the follicles of the ovary, whereas the uterine cycle is the changes in the endometrial lining of the uterus. So going into the ovarian cycle here, we have the follicular phase. So this is the first part of the ovarian cycle. This is where the follicle growth occurs. It lasts about 10 to 21 days. Next, we go into ovulation, and ovulation is when the ovary releases the oocyte. And then we have the luteal phase. And the luteal phase is it's the transformation of the ruptured follicle that goes into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts to secrete a lot of hormones, and this begins to prepare the body for pregnancy. However, if the pregnancy doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum begins to, it stops secreting the hormones, and the ovarian cycle begins. While you have the ovarian cycle going on, though, there's the uterine cycle. So in the uterine cycle, menses, this is the beginning of the follicular phase that you see in the ovarian cycle. And then you have the proliferative phase. So this is when the endometrium begins to add a layer of cells. So this is, generally with the corpus luteum that we have. So the corpus luteum is preparing for pregnancy. And then at the same time, you have the proliferative phase where the endometrium is adding new layers of cells to prepare the body for pregnancy to hold a viable pregnancy. And then we have the secretory phase. And the secretory phase corresponds with the luteal phase. So there's no pregnancy. Thus, the endometrium begins to shed its lining, and this is all during the menstruation, and the uterine cycle begins again. So we're going to talk about some of the hormonal controls of the menstrual cycle. So we have a nice little diagram here to make things a little bit easier. So ovarian and uterine cycles are under the control of hormones, and a lot of the hormones are secreted through the follicles, through the corpus luteum, things like that. So we have GnRH, we have FSH, LH, estrogen, progesterone, inhibin, and anti-Mullerian hormone, which is going to be abbreviated as AMH. And GnRH is just gonadotropic releasing hormone, FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, LH is luteinizing hormone. So during the follicular phase, we have estrogen, which is the most dominant. We have in the ovulation phase, there's which is triggered by a large surge in luteinizing hormone and FSH. And in the luteal phase, progesterone is the hormone that dominates. So in the early to mid follicular phase, this is your first day of menstruation. So gonadotropin secretion increases greatly. Under the follicle stimulating hormone, you have the tertiary follicles in the ovaries, which begin to mature. That was what we were talking about in the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. You have the thecal cells, which will synthesize androgens to granulosa cells, and they're going to be converted to estrogen. So estrogen starts to secrete this negative, starts to exert this negative feedback on the pituitary, which on the pituitary to have FSH and LH secretion, and this will prevent more follicles from developing. Then we're going to go into the mid-late follicular phase and ovulation. So in the mid to late follicular phase, you have estrogen secretion, which is at its peak. The granulosa cells that we mentioned before, they become the dominant follicle, and they start to secrete inhibin, progesterone, and estrogen. Estrogen, which was previously doing a negative feedback on the pituitary, now gets changed to a positive feedback, and the GnRH will surge, which will cause the luteinizing hormone to increase dramatically. FSH also increases, but it does not increase as dramatically as LH. The luteinizing hormone surge triggers secretion of chemical signals for the oocyte to mature, and the high levels of estrogen prepare the uterus for the possible pregnancy. So, like we were talking about before, this is the uterine lining, the endometrium becoming a lot thicker. You get vaginal discharge, all of these things to help have a viable pregnancy in the body. Then we have ovulation. This occurs 16 to 24 hours after luteinizing hormone peaks. And so the egg is transported to the fallopian tube and it's carried away to either be fertilized by the sperm or it will die. And obviously, in a non-gravid female and a non-pregnant female, this means that the egg will not be mature and become fertilized. In our early mid-luteal phase, the thecal cells and the follicular cells will transform into luteal cells. So as the luteal phase progresses, the corpus luteum that we mentioned earlier that produces a lot of hormones in preparation for the pregnancy, it'll produce increased levels of progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. So progesterone is dominant and estrogen begins to decrease and then it'll start to increase again. Estrogen and progesterone exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus and then on the pituitary, and this will stop or it will suppress the gonadotropin secretion, thus decreasing FSH and LH. And then we're going to go into the late luteal phase and menstruation. So the corpus luteum has a lifespan of about 12 days, and in those 12 days, if there is no fertilization, then the corpus luteum will undergo apoptosis, which is just programmed cell death. So degeneration of the luteal cells leads to decreased levels of progesterone and estrogen. These decreased levels stop the negative feedback signal, and then FSH and LH secretion will increase again, and then we go back into the cycle where the feedback will come into the pituitary, increase levels of estrogen, and we'll start the follicular development for a new cycle all over again. So menstruation is, the act of the menses. So this is about 14 days after ovulation, and it occurs about 2 days after the corpus luteum begins to degenerate, and the endometrium will just begin to slough off. And that sloughing of the endometrium is what women see when they begin to menstruate. So, bloody vaginal discharge. Menstruation typically lasts about 3 to 7 days, can be accompanied by cramping, diarrhea, constipation, nausea, fatigue, weakness, all of those things. And so once menstruation is over, the cycle will repeat and we'll go back into the follicular phase of the next ovulatory cycle. And the body will again begin to prepare for pregnancy. Pregnancy does not occur. Corpus luteum will undergo degeneration once again, and menstruation will occur. And that is the cycle, the feedbacks for the non-gravid female in the reproductive system. Thank you so much for listening.